look, when you have a war, you have front lines, and the front lines change. And so basically, in order to get someone to go back from those front lines, to retreat from those front lines, you have to give that other side some kind of concessions. The Iranians are saying, we haven't gotten our concessions yet. So this is basically the spoils of that war, which we did not initiate, but which we used to advance our position.
So it does look like the war in Iran is not escalating. It does look like there have been some diplomatic developments. It's not a big surprise. Donald Trump has made such threats, threatening to annihilate Iran, threatening to bomb it to smithereens. He's talked in very grandiose terms, and this time was no different. And a lot of people this time around were calling his bluff even early on, and the Iranians definitely did. They were just like, bring it on. He didn't bring it on. He pointed to some diplomatic achievement, probably a dubious diplomatic achievement. There does seem to be some talks going on with the Omanis about a potential deal for the Strait of Hormuz that would satisfy some Iranian requirements as well as some requirements for the Gulf states and especially Oman. We'll see if the deal that is being outlined and floated about in the press is something that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis could withstand, because actually it's the Omanis who are the most sympathetic to the Iranian position. And then every other Gulf state is less sympathetic, with Bahrain and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates the least sympathetic to the Iranian position and the least willing to withstand any kind of changes to the free traffic that went through the Strait of Hormuz before the war. I'm Borzu Daragahi, and you're listening or watching to Badlands, my podcast. You can find me at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Spotify and on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts. Would be great if you wanted to subscribe on YouTube. I'm also kind of starting to load some content there, like stuff that is paid and later on becomes free. I put it on YouTube because it's just a better platform for that kind of stuff, for that kind of podcast. So if you want, that's a very good place to find me and to subscribe and to keep an eye on for additional content and content that becomes free. So let's say you're in a situation where country A attacks country B, and country A kind of gets his ass kicked. It doesn't do so well in the war. Not only that, but country B seizes some territory from country A, and then country A says, okay, let's stop fighting, let's agree to a deal, and so on. And then country A says, but first you have to give back the territory that you seized in the war. And country B is like, no, that's the spoils of war. We won this, and if you want it back, then you're going to have to negotiate, and you're going to have to offer us some concessions. And that's essentially the situation we're in with the United States and Iran. The United States on February 28th, with the help and the goading of Israel, attacked Iran in what many consider a violation of international law. It was a really horrific attack in which 168 school children, their parents, and their teachers were killed. They killed the Iranian supreme leader, the spiritual head of many Shia throughout the world. They killed a whole bunch of leadership and so on. But the country A, the United States, didn't achieve any of its strategic goals. In fact, it created new strategic challenges and new problems for itself that it has to now resolve. Then you have a situation where country A, the United States, which started the war, says, okay, let's stop the war. Now let's go back to where we were before the war started. And country B is like, no, baby. Spoils of war. We got the Strait of Hormuz. We took control of it. And if you want us to give it up, you're going to have to pay an extremely high asking price. In fact, there is no asking price that the Iranians have given, really, for giving up the Strait of Hormuz. They're saying, no, this is basically it. This is our Alsace-Lorraine. We have taken this territory and we have gotten control of the Strait of Hormuz because you launched this war, and that's it. That's finished. And so the Iranian position, at least publicly, is quite intransigent. They're saying that it will never go back to the situation where boats and ships and battleships and military, et cetera, are moving in and out freely from the Strait of Hormuz. And so over the last few weeks and months since that April ceasefire, that memorandum of understanding, that's really what it's been about. The Americans basically refusing to acknowledge that they lost Alsace-Lorraine, that they lost the Strait of Hormuz, that they lost the free navigation they had through there. They just refuse to acknowledge it. And so then they keep resuming the bombing, hoping that the Iranians will give in. And the Iranians are just like, F you. We took it fair and square. And then, of course, there's issues of international law and so on. But, we're in an era where, for example, some countries like the United States and Israel, they basically piss on international law. If the Israelis can argue that, hey, Hamas and Hezbollah attacked us, and so by that logic, we get to take some of their territory, why can't the Iranians just simply argue, hey, the United States and Israel attacked us, so we're going to take some territory. We're going to take areas that used to be considered part of the international shipping lanes and turn them into an Iranian toll booth, essentially. And that's not exactly a great analogy, but I think that is not a bad one at this point. And some people will argue with me. They'll say that, oh, no, the Iranians have been waging war against the United States and the rest. Shut up. I mean, seriously, that's just BS. That's just ridiculous. The U.S. and Iran have been in a sort of on and off clandestine war maybe for like the last quarter century or so. And that has been both ways. Before that, there were atrocities on both sides. Yes, the Iranian students took control of the U.S. embassy. That was a horrific and kind of belligerent act, an act of war. Those issues that were created by the taking of the U.S. embassy in 1979 were resolved in 1981 through the Algiers Accords. The U.S. signed on to that, okay? None other than the butt buddy of the conservatives and the neoconservatives, their fave, Ronald Reagan, signed on to that. So seriously, just shut the fuck up. I mean, what more can I say? There's not been a war between Iran and the rest of the world for 47 years. If you want to go back that far, you can go back to 1953. Some people will say, oh, you want to talk about ancient history now? Well, okay, let's stop talking about the Holocaust then. Let's stop talking about ancient history. Let's stop talking about the Armenian genocide. What's the statute of limitations on when you can talk about it? So this idea that this war has been going on for 47 years, no, it just doesn't fly. It's just a neocon talking point that's taken up by some Republicans. It's just bullshit. So no one buys it. No one buys it anymore. I even see like MSM newscasters kind of rolling their eyes whenever one of these neocon shills or their political operatives and their paid politicians, their paid elected officials on the Hill come up with this talking point of the U.S. and Iran have been locked in a war for 47 years. I've seen like mainstream journalists on like CNN and NBC just being like, no, don't say that. Don't make yourself out to be a jackass. So no one buys that. Let's just start with this war that started in June of 2025. That's basically when the war started. And then we can move on from there. And let's not talk about ancient history, because if you want to talk about ancient history, there's a lot of ancient history that you can talk about. So I think that that is a pretty good way of seeing this conflict and why there's been so much intransigence on the part of both the Iranians and the Americans. The Americans refused to acknowledge that they lost, and the Iranians refused to basically give in on American demands. They're not going to give up on the Strait of Hormuz. And what's interesting is the deal that they've come up with is a kind of face-saving package, I think, for Donald Trump to just accept. And that is basically ships coming into the Strait of Hormuz, into the Persian Gulf, go through the Iranian channel and have to get sort of the Iranian seal of approval. And ships going out can go pass freely through the Omani channel, through Omani territorial waters. And that will get legitimate traffic flowing in and out of the Persian Gulf again. It will relieve the sailors, the poor sailors and marine employees, the employees of marine vessels, merchant marines and others who are working on these ships. It will give them some relief, give them a chance to go back to their families. They're basically marooned on these ships in the Persian Gulf now for weeks and months. They can go back to their homes and move on with their lives and so on. It will get the global economy going again, while at the same time meeting at least one of Iran's security demands. This setup allows Iran to at least secure one of what it says its main security concerns is that the opening up of the Strait of Hormuz will allow the U.S., and the United Arab Emirates, and other nefarious actors to build up military equipment in the Persian Gulf again. There's other ways to get military equipment into the Persian Gulf, but none is better than just bringing in battleships and ships and freighters full of military equipment and military gear. And by controlling who enters the Persian Gulf, you actually, of course, you control who exits as well. So let's see if Donald Trump actually goes for this ruse, which is what it is, this packaging of de facto Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz and over the Persian Gulf. And also, we got to see if the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis and Kuwaitis and Bahrainis will go for it as well. Qatar may also not go for it because it does essentially give Iran de facto control over the Strait of Hormuz. But that's what you get when you launch a war and you lose. That's what you get when you launch an illegal war of aggression and you lose. That's basically the consequences. So I think that the Iranian attitude is just going to be like, this is it, take it or leave it. And they're not going to essentially give in to the American demands. They haven't so far. There is some suggestion of this blockade, land blockade. These neocon shills, their latest idea is that we get all of the, I forget how many it is, 7 or 8 countries that have land borders with Iran to just stop allowing Iranian goods to move in and out of their borders. And that will really be the maximum pressure that was never really tried on Iran. Again, fuck you, essentially. And it's also just not going to work. You're talking about countries like Armenia. You're talking about countries which are very close to Iran. You're talking about Turkey, which has an independent foreign policy and does not want to get involved in this conflict at all. Also stands to make a good deal of money through smuggling and legitimate commercial trade with Iran. And you're talking about Iraq, which to some extent remains a semi-vassal state of Iran. And you're talking like Turkmenistan, somewhat of a Russian satellite state, not totally, of course, but they're not going to go for it. And that's the longest border, I do believe. Maybe Azerbaijan would go for it, but I think that that would even be dicey for Aliyev right now because there's a sensitive time right now in Iran-Azerbaijan relations. Iran can do a lot of damage to Azerbaijan. No country is going to go for that. And then Afghanistan, well, there's not much trade there. And then Pakistan, which also has an independent foreign policy, is very concerned about maintaining decent relations with Iran and also has a commercial interest in keeping that border open, that land border open, get some cheap gas and get some cheap oil and diesel over the borders. So they're not going to go for that either. It might actually be the opposite. As the U.S. puts more and more economic pressure on Iran, these are the countries that stand to benefit from that pressure by getting some good deals from Iranian trade. So I don't think that's basically going to happen. It's not a realistic goal and so on. In any case, I spoke a little bit about these topics in interviews with Pakistan's Express 24 News with my colleague Hassan Fahd, who's a great interviewer.
You know, every time we've spoken, there's been a different kind of a situation. There was a time when we all thought that this was winding down and things were actually coming back to the negotiating table. That's all changed now. In fact, it's now expanding. So where is this conflict right now, in your opinion?
So I don't think it was ever really winding down. And I don't think that ever anyone who has been watching this closely could believe that it was winding down. There was a period that Donald Trump decided pretty much on his own to agree to the Iranian demands, basically, in order to give himself a pause. He agreed to those Iranian demands without any intention whatsoever following through on any of the points that he agreed to. And he promptly violated pretty much all of them, except for the sanctions waiver on Iranian oil, which he quickly removed as well when things got a little bit dicey and a little bit questionable. They removed the sanctions waiver. So basically, Iran got nothing, and it saw that it was getting nothing. And so it was preparing for the next round this whole time. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to flood the region with military equipment and hardware. There's been a constant flow of weapons from the United States to Europe and then on to the Middle East. And open source intelligence experts have been monitoring this and watching this. And of course, the Iranians have been monitoring this and watching this. So they knew pretty much from the start what was going to happen, that there was this attempt to replenish the oil stocks and so on. And the Iranians basically, in some respects, called the bluff of the United States by bombing these ships in the Strait of Hormuz and giving the U.S. really no reason to continue with this fake memorandum of understanding. That's why we have this situation right now. And what is happening with the expansion, we can talk about as well.
In fact, before we go to that, I want to touch upon something which has suddenly happened out of nowhere and now is creating a lot of ripples. I'm, of course, talking about the Ukrainian attack on the Iranian ship. And so much talk now about the Ukrainians wanting to connect the two wars somehow. So how are you reading that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Ukrainians are in need of American, especially Western support. They see that the U.S. is pretty much focused almost entirely on this issue here in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. So by linking the two conflicts together, I think that Volodymyr Zelensky hopes he can get that U.S. support. What Ukraine needs is interceptors and Patriot batteries and anti-missile defense that it does not have, and it needs to purchase from the West. And the U.S. is using all of those in the Middle East. So if he can link the wars together, he can perhaps get some help. I think that's his thinking.
But do you think there's a danger that that front could escalate?
I'm not sure. I think there's also some diplomatic back channels going on between Iran and Ukraine, trying to make it so that this does not escalate, so the situation does not escalate. I think there's different factions inside both countries, some that would like it to escalate, some that wouldn't. I think in some, it would be really disadvantageous for the Iranian side if Ukraine were to enter the war. Here's a country that's been used to being bombed to smithereens like Iran has been bombed for just a few months for the last 4 years. So they have a lot of pain tolerance as well.
Now, the other flashpoint which has happened is the bombing or the drone attack on two American ships on the Egyptian port, which is, in fact, if I may just point it out for our viewers, it's somewhere right here, right next to the Suez Canal. We already know that this Bab al-Mandab is almost blocked, disrupted. Is this targeting of this area around the Suez Canal? How does that make sense? I mean, I know that Iran hasn't said that we've done it. They've said we haven't done it. But so what happened there? What do you think is the logic behind that?
I think the logic, if it is the Iranians and not some other nefarious actor in the equation, perhaps one that's very close to the Suez Canal, far closer than Iran, I think that the logic is clear. Is like, you're not saying we're going to deplete your assets much quicker than you think we're going to. We're going to expand the war to multiple fronts. You're going to have to defend multiple fronts. It's going to be a further and quicker depletion of your resources than you calculated for. You're going to have to be defending ships here, ships there, installations here, installations there. You're going to have to be thinking about Turkey. You're going to have to be thinking about the Horn of Africa. You're going to have to be thinking about the Northern Mediterranean. You're going to have to perhaps at some point even be thinking about a ship moored off of Italy or even California. And so that will deplete American resources. So the Americans, rather than the Iranians mean business, that this is an unlimited war, if that's what the Americans want, the Iranians can play that game too. That would be the logic if that is the case. The Iranians are doing this. As you pointed out, the Iranians are denying it.
But if the battlefield enlarges, many geographic locations sort of come within the ambit of where the conflict is, then by that argument, you're saying that suits Iran. It's a war strategy which is well thought out. It will give the advantage to the Iranian side, and it will even give the initiative to the Iranian side. So from their point of view, it does make sense to keep expanding it horizontally.
I mean, it's a risky strategy. If that is the Iranian strategy, it's a very high risk maneuver on the part of the Iranians because it could backfire. And that is, very dangerous for the Iranians. If in fact these countries like Egypt, like other countries who have been mostly staying out of the conflict, decide to enter the conflict, that could put more pressure, more military pressure potentially on the Iranians. For now, at least, though, this kind of calibrated attack just on American-owned or connected ships off of the Egyptian coast, not on Egypt proper, not on Egyptian assets, but on American-linked assets. I think that is what you see in the calibration of that effort. And that's why they don't want to go all out and start hitting Egyptian military sites.
Here's an interview I did recently about the situation, the possibility that there will be a war and the possibility of a peace in an interview with India's NewsX World.
What are we to make of the latest escalation that we're seeing between Iran and Oman's Strait of Hormuz? And have we heard anything about the cooperation mechanism that was posted or suggested from Oman to Iran?
Yeah, I think the cooperation mechanism was already rejected by Iran because it was described and presented as a voluntary organization or mechanism to which countries and shippers could sign on to, and that's just not acceptable to Iran at this point. With regard to the broader issue, yeah, this is going to happen, and it's pretty obvious why there's escalation in the region. The Iranians say that the memorandum of understanding and the end of the war put in place a situation where the Iranians controlled the Strait of Hormuz. And this war was imposed on Iran unjustly, arguably illegally, without any immediate provocation. And so this is the last demarcation line of the war. Look, when you have a war, you have front lines, and the front lines change. And so basically, in order to get someone to go back from those front lines, to retreat from those front lines, you have to have some kind of negotiation. You have to come to some kind of deal. You have to give that other side some kind of concessions. The Iranians are saying, we haven't gotten our concessions yet. So this is basically the spoils of that war, which we did not initiate, but which we used to advance our position.
Looking at this situation with Iran war, we are also learning reports about the call that took place between foreign ministers of Iran as well as UK. Do you think that Iran strategically decided to have contact with UK because they felt or they feared that UK might continue to let US use their bases?
That might have come up in the conversation. I think more of it was having to do with the designation of the Revolutionary Guard Corps as a threatening organization or a terrorist organization. I'm not sure what language the UK used. This just broke earlier today. And I think that the Iranians wanted to caution the UK as to what this would mean and how to complicate matters rather than help matters. Yet the UK is under a lot of pressure. They're under pressure from the United States, which wants the Europeans and the Western powers to designate the IRGC as a terrorist or militant or an outlaw organization. They want to complicate any kind of diplomatic endeavors with Iran. Look, the IRGC is a very large, sprawling organization that includes military, includes huge parts of the economy and so on. So to designate it basically makes 1 million plus people potentially on a terrorist list. And that includes like 18-year-old draftees. So there is a argument to be made that it is kind of absurd to designate a whole organization with so many tentacles and so many social roots, a outlawed organization.
Right. Talking about that, the draftees in Iran, if I'm wrong, please correct me, Mr. Dargahi. So in Iran, it's a mandatory thing for 18 years old to go to IRGC, right? Or military?
No, I mean, it's mandatory military service, but you don't get to decide really which service you'll go into, the Army or the IRGC. So it could just be the luck of the draw. The IRGC is part of the military infrastructure of Iran. And so if you get drafted, you don't really have a choice whether you go into the Army or the IRGC. It's just where it's designated that you go. On the other hand, I think that you can decide that you prefer the IRGC, but you can't say that you prefer the Army.
Of course, a lot of countries are trying to make Iran isolated. But do you think that instead of just making Iran isolated, they're forcing or making the bond of Russia, China, Iran stronger?
Well, I think that's already getting stronger, and maybe they can't control that. Maybe that is a dynamic that is going in that direction in any case. But what they are doing by designating the IRGC or designating this organization and isolating Iran in the way that they're doing it is making diplomacy impossible, making diplomacy toxic. This is a strategy that the neoconservatives in the United States used to create the momentum to create this war and launch this war. And those same ideological characters are in the European countries, They're in India as well, and they're arguing for the same thing. They're pushing for the same thing. It's an attempt to block off diplomacy and make military confrontation inevitable.
And this time also, the escalation started right after we saw President Netanyahu meet U.S. President, right? What are we to make of this pattern?
Well, I think that they did probably confer. I think that Netanyahu shared his plans and his visions and his hopes with the U.S. and U.S. officials. But the reception he got in Washington from the Trump administration, especially from Trump himself, was rather standoffish and not so warm. It wasn't such a bear hug as we've seen in the past. So it remains unclear whether there is any huge plan coming up. There is this announcement, there's these leaks in the media that this huge attack is coming, that Iran should be ready, that there's going to be a massive attack. Remember, it's Friday, so the markets are closed now, and they can up the escalation rhetoric and threaten Iran and try to get a deal and try to push Iran and press Iran, or they can even launch new attacks. But I don't think that they will, not this weekend at least, because when you're going to launch a massive attack on a country, you don't get on you don't call up CNN and say, hey, we're going to launch a massive attack on this country. That's basically a signaling exercise, not a military strategy.
So over the weekend, just after Donald Trump said that he had made a deal with Hamas and brokered this breakthrough in the ceasefire, Israel responded by bombing a medical supply center in Gaza with a 2,000-pound bomb. Not sure about the casualties, but the cruelty of this attack. The Israelis, to their credit, at least did warn people to vacate the area, but they destroyed just a lot of medical equipment. They said that there was Hamas weapons hiding there. I'm not sure what weapons we're talking about at this point, a few Kalashnikovs, but they destroyed a lot of medical equipment and medical supplies that were donated to the people of Gaza. And in any case, I spoke a little bit in an interview with NPR's Here and Now about the Trump brokered peace deal and whether it means anything significant for the region and for the long-suffering people of Gaza.
President Trump says the Board of Peace he created last year has brokered a historic agreement with Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that until this month governed Gaza for nearly 20 years. For its part, Hamas says it won't hand over heavy weapons unless Israel ends its aggression and withdraws from Gaza first. A senior Israeli official says it will not withdraw further without Hamas disarming first. If that sounds familiar, it was part of a 20-point peace deal announced last fall. For more, let's bring in Middle East correspondent Borzu Daragahi. Borzu, good to have you back.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
So, Borzu, after Trump's announcement, which came last night, a senior Hamas official told NPR that Israel must withdraw from Gaza first. A senior Israeli official says Hamas has to disarm first. That's been a sticking point all along. So what is different today?
I don't think there's much different. I think that this is not really that relevant of a deal. It's just something that Donald Trump put out on Truth Social. Maybe there were some breakthroughs in the negotiations, and he was trying to repackage that. More than anything, probably Hamas did this. It agreed to this, or it appeared to agree to this, in order to throw the wrench into the upcoming Israeli elections, to sow a little bit of confusion and doubt on the part of both Netanyahu's supporters and those of the opposition.
Okay, that's interesting. So not just trying to get positive attention for the White House, because what we have seen happen before with negotiations on Gaza or negotiations with Iran over the war there, Trump has announced an agreement has been reached. That's good news for the White House, especially at the end of the week when there's other stuff going on like Todd Blanche. But then the agreements end up falling through and fighting resumes. So is this a distraction technique for domestic audiences to say, don't pay attention over there to the, attorney general confirmation fight, which is not going well? Or is this really an attempt to interfere or put his thumb on the scale in what's happening on the ground in Israel and Gaza?
Does it really seem like he cares what's happening on the ground in Gaza with the Palestinians? There's been daily violence in Gaza, near daily violence, and the Israeli bombing continues, and the occupation of 60% of Gaza continues, and he doesn't seem to care much about that. What he does care about, as you pointed out, is the news cycle, throwing some good news into the news cycle, getting some positive headlines out there. Like I said, more likely than not, there is ongoing diplomatic developments. There are positive things happening diplomatically behind the scenes that we're not privy to. And he probably caught wind of that and thought that he would throw this out there to get some good headlines up there. And hey, look, it's working.
Okay. Last question, Borzun. We only have a minute left. Peace deals between longtime adversaries, they're hard to get. For the Northern Ireland peace deal is just one example. 30 years of violent conflict, 2 years of constant negotiation engagement with international negotiators closely involved. What conditions would be really needed to get to that really elusive Hamas-Israel peace? Each side has certain must-haves.
Yeah, I think that a certain measure of confidence building would be required, and that would take months. But also on the part of the negotiators and interlocutors, more disinterested interlocutors, the Trump administration is so clearly on the side of one party in this battle that it can't reasonably be a mediator in this conflict.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at borzou.substack.com, and you can also find me on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, and on Spotify.